Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the People's Perspective on Development with your host, myself, Tunisia Kasim. Today, I've got an interesting episode for you guys. We've had discussions on what is public life, what is public space, what is the relationship between the two. We also got to look at a great, inspiring book, How to Study Public Life, in episode 2, and the various tools that are available to us to observe and understand this phenomena about what is public space. Today, I've got a really great academic, professional, author, uh, urban designer, and architect at heart, who has really taken the time to have a conversation about her love for public space. And I'm really excited that you guys are going to join me today. And today's topic is about let's hear from an academic. As I just mentioned, we're hearing from a pretty prestigious academic in the field, Professor Karina Landman from the University of Pretoria. She is currently a lecturer at the Department of Town and Regional Planning at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And she focuses mainly on spatial transformation, including research on gated communities and sustainable neighborhoods, resilient cities, and of course, the design of public space. And that was what piqued my key interest. And considering her vast knowledge on public space, researching on sustainable development, and how do we include this in our public spaces, really has me excited for the conversations we're about to have today. And I can't wait to take you guys through. Step into the questions, of course. Ma'am, if you can share with us, where did you grow up? When you were a child, what did you want to be and why?
Okay, so I grew up in the Free State in South Africa,
Right.
first in a very small little rural town.
Right.
And I think that's where my interest in town started
Right.
because we walked barefoot, and it was a
Yeah.
time when you could still walk wherever you wanted to. Often my parents didn't know where I was, and I would just sort of stroll through the dirt roads, and thinking about back to that, I can't believe that it was South Africa and that I didn't even know where I was when I was preschool. But anyway, that was the kind of context. When I was a child, I wanted to be a lot of things. Definitely not a planner. I didn't even know about planning. For a long time, I wanted to be a doctor.
Okay.
That was one of the things, I think, because I love helping people. I always thought
Yeah.
that was my first kind of how can I help people, but that suffered dramatically in high school when I learned that you need serious maths for that.
Yes, I can relate with civil engineering. I failed science in grade 9 straight, and I was like, yep, it's not for me.
Yeah.
And then eventually, like, I think most of us didn't actually know what town planning was, but just to explain your journey, how did you find out what town planning was and why did you choose to pursue it?
Okay, so my journey is I loved art, any kinds of art. So in high school, I did art and I did graphic art, and since I can remember, I drew. So that was always my passion in life. So my father believed that I cannot be an artist because I will not be able to support myself. So he said I should be an architect. So I studied architecture and finished and everything. And then in my last year, my fifth year of architecture, while I was doing my dissertation, I actually found out that there is something like planning. Well, mostly urban design. And then I applied for um, to do a master's in urban design and planning at UCT, and that from there I never looked back. So that was how I actually ended up in planning, and yeah, urban design is still my love, my first love, but yeah, that's how I got to planning, and the more I do it, the more I realize, but that's actually what I always wanted to do. I just came to it via architecture, and it helped me. I think it helped me to also understand I mean, I'll get to public space now, but then you'll
Yes.
understand why I'm so interested in public space.
At least that sort of helped you stay within the artistic space, and still incorporate that love that you have
Yes,
for design. And
yes.
to relate it back, what are the areas that you're passionate about in town planning itself?
Yeah, so as I said just now, it's always been the low scale. So precinct
Yes.
planning, urban design,
Mm-hmm.
public spaces, the public
Yeah.
realm, all those areas of how can you make a city work better for people that actually move through these spaces every day, by
Definitely.
looking at things like design, land uses, the environment around them, how does it work, how do you change it, and
Mm-hmm.
all those kind of things. So looking back, that's always been a kind of consideration. And that's the one part. The other part is, um, I also do quite a lot of work in terms of sustainable development,
Okay.
and so I also have a huge love for nature. So part
Mm-hmm.
of that is how do we work with nature, in
Yes.
terms of designing cities that will kind of be in harmony with nature.
Definitely.
How do we use resources sustainably? How do we create use all those things to create better opportunities in cities? So yeah, hence my love for public spaces,
Okay.
because it includes both the natural side, the
Yes.
nature, the sustainability, but also that part of the city which is not public, private. I always
Yes.
say I define it
Mhm.
in the negative. So I see public
Yes.
space as everything that's not private. Um,
True.
and then you really understand how important those spaces. I mean, Jane Jacobs long ago said that
Yes.
it's those areas that can make or break a city. If you really want to
Definitely.
understand if a city works or whether it's livable, the streets or the other
Mm.
spaces, then you should really just go and see if those areas work.
Makes it. There was even a term that we kind of used of in between the buildings. There's this forgotten space, which is where
Yeah.
actually public life and activity takes place. That's where most people are, people who do not have the opportunity to own a private car, and majority of pedestrians and an informal business and so forth. We're seeing a lot of that taking place in this in between space. Let's
Yeah,
see.
and I mean, a lot of the critique from urban designers was really,
Mhm.
during the modern movement, that there was this
Mhm.
lost space that was created, and
Yes.
it related exactly to what you said now.
Mm. And then I think actually you might have covered this, but let's look at it from a locational point of view. What about the design and how space functions in different locations? Have you noticed that transition that, if you're in a more affluent area that sometimes is more attractive towards investment in public space, which is usually privatized, versus, these public spaces that are sometimes almost neglected and not maintained? Have you seen that? Like, and just your thoughts on location and public space.
I think there's very interesting trends around that around the world, but
Mhm.
also in South Africa.
Yes.
Especially in South Africa with our history,
Mm.
of apartheid and, different
Yes.
standards of development for different areas in the city. Um,
Mm.
I think that's one reason. So you often saw underdevelopment in marginalized areas,
Yes.
and but I think it goes much deeper than that.
Mhm.
There are also different ideas around things like public space. So, for
Mm.
example, in your more traditional communities, if you go to
Mhm.
traditional areas in the country, where the ownership is still under the chief, and
Yes.
the local leader, they don't have a concept like public space. You ask for a right to occupy a space, and you
Mhm.
can build a house on that, and people just move all in between all the other
Yeah.
spaces, which is basically owned by the chief or the leader of that area. So it's a very interesting, this notion of public spaces is kind of more coming from the north in terms of legal definitions, where
That's
you
interesting.
look at zoning, where
Mm-hmm.
you would say certain areas are for residential, certain areas are for whatever commercial business,
Yes,
whatever typical
yes,
land use. You demarcate spaces, plots, streets, all of that, and then you specifically demarcate a space for public use, and it can be
mm-hmm.
for green use, open space systems. It can be at
Yes,
different scales, or it can be a street for movement, or it can be whatever. But the areas are particularly demarcated specifically for that. So it goes
yes,
into a zoning, into a scheme. This is what's supposed to happen on that site. The problem with that is that everybody doesn't understand it like that. So
true.
often research that we've done in township areas, as they used to be called,
Yes,
is shown that they never really wanted this space. Why should they have that
true.
space? And then, and that's the one side of it. They don't understand that particular meaning. However, if you start linking it back to a village system where you would have a place where the community would come together, or
Yes,
the leaders would have their lechotla or the whatever in
yes.
more traditional settlements, then suddenly they understand exactly what it is. So again, in some
Interesting.
of the rural towns, if you call it something different, then they know exactly what the function is, but the
Interesting.
naming is problematic. So I think that's one issue. The other issue, of course, is if you have this thing that is zoned for a specific use,
Yes,
and if you don't develop it, then it's not going to be used like that, or it's
definitely.
going to be changed. So what we also find often in lower income areas is that they never develop the area. So it's just this vacant open space. It becomes prone to
Yes.
criminal activities and things like that. On the other side, if the space was just zoned, it was never developed with the community, then they don't have ownership of it. And then it becomes vandalized, it becomes neglected. I mean, they burn trees, they do this, they break the furniture, the play areas, the whatever. And it's easy to say, okay, the community don't
Yes.
care and whatever, but they were never really involved in
Involved.
the kind
Mm.
of conceptualization of
Yes.
that particular space. So yeah, I think there's lots of issues here, but definitely locations play a role. The other opposite side of it, it's not just wealthy and poor and poor. The opposite side of that is if you get extreme suburbia, they don't care about public
Mm.
space because
That's true.
they live in their own backyards, which is luscious. It's well developed.
Mm.
I've also written, you probably pick it up, about a lot about gated
Yes.
communities.
Yes.
So I mean, they privatize space inside there. Um, so there's different conceptualizations. In terms of, first of all, what's the meaning of it, and then is it really
Mm.
necessary, or how do people relate to it, or what kinds of so-called common spaces is still relevant today. So I think, yeah,
Definitely.
definitely locations play a role, um, and definitely the types of settlements that we have in our
Mm.
South African cities play a huge role in terms of how people would think about
Yes.
something like a public space or a common space.
You actually mentioned something so interesting that I think we often take for granted for in the land use management section. Most of the time, the areas that we're supposed to demarcate for park conservation, we do it as a tick box exercise because it is a requirement for our applications to actually be approved or considered during circulation. And I see it a lot even with our own projects in practice, is that, we try and calculate how can we possibly just sort of allocate a park just for, the sake that, even though that's not the focus of the development, and we don't even actually put a lot of thought into the design, but it makes sense because then we can put our attenuation ponds running through a conservation area, but we demarcate it for conservation, but it's not really what we're going to use it for, which is very sad because a lot of the times we think, we are doing holistic planning, but actually there's a serious focus sometimes more on return of investment or ensuring that the community doesn't object. There's quite like it's a very interesting conflict that almost takes place between what people want and versus what we think they want as well.
Absolutely. I think that's incredibly important. In a recent PhD study, a student of mine worked in Buffalo City in the
Okay.
Eastern Cape, and she did a lot of interviews in different regions. It
Yeah.
ties back to the locational issue, and there was nature of the regions, not the
Mm-hmm.
detailed locations. And in some of the regions, they said they don't want public space; they want more
Wow.
housing. Rather use
Okay.
that piece of land to build more low-income housing
There we go.
than the public space, because they're not going to use it. It's just going to be for criminals. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I mean, we were both so incredibly passionate about public space, and it was such a shock to hear this
Yes.
from the community. Says, no, we want low-income housing. We don't want public space.
Wow. It also shows the perceptions, where we, try and sort of say that, let's build something that, meets the requirements of public space, meets service delivery. In the meantime, people are like, no, this is specifically what we want. If it's not that, don't bother. It's very interesting how development works with what people want. I think this is a great example that I picked up and I came across. It's in Singapore, and it's this mega block of mixed use. And they've just, they've defined it as a successful public urban space that has a multitude of uses. It has healthcare, education, and I see a lot of the urban areas moving into these big super blocks, especially, like here in Sandton with these new residential areas having like rooftop recreational spaces and hotels and commercial. What do you think of this as a, sort of successful public space? Do you think that it serves well? I mean, it does, have the facilities, but just in terms of quality and mass, what are your thoughts?
Oh, it's definitely a trend worldwide. I mean,
Yeah.
especially in Asia. If you go
Yeah.
and look at China and all over, and I mean everywhere. You said now, yeah, Singapore. There's definitely this trend to do these mega blocks, and to have common spaces linked to them. I don't think I'll call them public, but
Yeah.
common spaces. And I think that links to the whole debate around the privatization of public space.
Mm,
So in these so-called mega blocks or gated areas, they become privatized.
yeah.
They are a very valuable resource to the people who stay in there. And obviously there can be different models. I mean, the one
Yes.
that you show here, I'm not familiar
Mm-hmm.
with, but it looks like it can be a kind of development where some of it at least has got restricted access just for the
Yeah.
residents, and it would then be
Yes.
partially privatized. Um, so that's one module. There are obviously other spaces in Singapore which is very famous for
Yes.
everybody can access them, and very good examples of
Mm-hmm.
public space. But I think it depends on how much of it is accessible and not. I mean, there's been
Okay.
interesting debates on Hong Kong, and
Yes.
I had the privilege to go there to a conference where they're developing the whole debate is around vertical urbanism, and they're
Okay.
developing the second and third layers of streets. So it's almost as if you've got
Wow.
a second layer of street in the sky. So all these
Yes.
urban tower blocks are connected by walkways, and those walkways between these tower blocks have then start to have all these mixed uses. So they start
Wow.
to have the shops and the this and the that and whatever. And they become a whole secondary city almost on that
Jeez.
level that's not on the street level. And a lot of it is privatized. So there's very
Wow.
interesting discussions in terms of what does that do to a city, and also it's beneficial on the one hand because it's a comfortable environment. It's aircon. Now, if you've been in Hong Kong,
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty dense. I mean, Singapore is even worse. I've now got a
Okay.
former student that's in Singapore.
Wow.
It's temperature wise, it's really challenging. Um, but so you've got this wonderful controlled environment on the second level, but what does it do with you to your relationship to the street and to the broader environment and to nature, and to all of those kind of things, to the broader social and ecological ecosystem in the city. So yeah, there are very interesting debates around this. I do think the fact that they do allow these common spaces in these big developments make them much more, what is the word? Lucrative for people. So when you have these high density developments, especially in the Asian cities, I mean, densities that we can't even imagine. I've never seen anything like. I've been to Brazil and I've walked down Avenida Paulista in Sao Paulo, and I thought I'll never ever see densities like that. And then I went to Hong Kong, and then that was nothing compared to Sao Paulo. So yeah, I mean, it's just densities that we can not imagine. But when you have those kind of densities, the only way to keep sane is to have these spaces where people can meet, they can interact, they can do certain things and so on. So I think the denser your city, the more, if I can put it in that way, the more crucial either the common spaces in these developments or the real public open spaces become. I mean, and I saw that in Hong Kong as well. I mean, when people finish working, I mean, everybody goes, it becomes so busy in those open spaces because you just need to get out. Imagine you sit in this small little unit. You've got a 2-bedroom apartment that's on the 50th floor somewhere, and a little kitchen and a bathroom, and that's it. I mean, you need to get out. So public spaces becomes really, really critical in environments like that.
I almost think of the psychology that it must have behind it as well. It's almost like a breathing space, you've got these high densities. At least there is somewhere that you can go and sort of, breathe, and you're not compacted into the small space. Because I've seen some videos of these tower developments in Hong Kong, and how small everyone is fitted into these almost like bunk bed apartments. I don't know how else to describe it. And, like there's a psychology almost behind it with public space that I don't think sometimes we even realize is important. Okay, we've answered this one about the public space. Hey guys, let's take a breather, take a break, take a moment. I know that we've had some informative discussions. Prof. Karina Landman has been extremely informative, knowledgeable, and we understand why she is a professional in the industry for understanding public space, understanding how it functions. What's very key here is, firstly, the ideas and the ideologies behind how is public space seen, how it is used, and how it functions in relation to the surroundings and the community it serves. For now, I'm going to take a break, take a breather, take time out to marinate on this amazing conversation. We will come back with the continuation of episode 5 to wrap up the discussion and unpack further case studies relating to South African context. And we're going to take some questions from you guys and hear from the people. But for now, it's goodbye, it's good night, it's farewell. From the people's perspective on development, I'm your host, Tunisia.